Hi guys, so for today's painting session, your goal is to have the primary hues painted, so the red, yellow, and blue hue sections painted. You're also going to be painting the hues of purple and orange.
So let's begin.
What I would recommend is choose a brush that's going to be best for your painting. If you have a brush that has lots of hard edges, then I would recommend getting your smaller rectangular brush. If you have a painting like I had here where everything's nice and curvy, then I would recommend grabbing maybe your rounded edge brush. That will help create more of that, rounder edge. Let's begin by painting in our red hues. You'll notice that we're going to be doing a gradated wash on dry paper. So take your brush, dip it in the water, and then find the deep crimson red. That's the red that we're going to want to use. Wet that palette to where the watercolor pigment is lifting off from it, and then you're going to apply that red paint directly in your hue section. Now, to get this straight edge, I'm going from side to side. Get a really nice, clean, crisp edge. Whenever you're painting with watercolor, you have to go at a swift pace because you don't want one section of the watercolor to dry, or else you'll end up leaving this harsh outline. So I'm constantly going back and forth from one part of my painting that I've done to the other. Always re-wetting my brush to keep the paint flowing. And I'm not going to do my gradation until I kind of get to the bottom portion of my hue section. It's just going to be a lot easier for me. So once again, I'm taking my time, making sure I have nice crisp edges. I'm re-wetting my brush. I'm making sure that I'm not letting my watercolor dry in an area I don't want to create a harsh edge. Once again, I'm taking my time as I'm painting along the edge here. Now that I have a nice solid red on the top, I can start creating my gradient. Now remember, you just dip a little bit of water into the brush. You hold the board at about a 30-degree angle to help the water flow. And then you drag the pigment across. I'm just going to gradually keep dipping my brush into the water, pulling my pigment down, creating nice crisp edges. So you can see that this takes some patience and time to create that really nice gradient. And I'm only thinning out the pigment on my brush by just slightly dipping it into the water. And when I get down to that corner, I'm just being really careful to keep that nice crisp edge. So here I have the gradient wash using my first hue. I need to paint that hue into every section that I've labeled. So I have a hue here that I have to paint and here. Go ahead and paint your red hue section into your triangle.
Once you're done, clean off the brush and then get a new cup of water. I always like to have 2 cups of water so I don't have to get up a bunch of times while I'm painting. But then you're going to be painting your yellow section. You want to use the light yellow, not the lemon yellow. The lemon yellow tends to have a greenish color, so we want the light yellow. Wet your brush, put it in the light yellow, and just get that water to lift up the pigment. We don't want to thin it out too much because we still want a nice solid yellow there whenever we're painting in our hue. Now remember, the hues should be painted as gradient washes. So the hue should be darkest at the top of the hue section and should gradually get lighter as it comes in towards the center of the triangle. When you paint, you have to make sure that the watercolor is staying wet. So wherever you've put that watercolor down first, you want to constantly keep going back and adding in wet watercolor to that first initial painted section. This will ensure that you won't have any harsh lines and that the whole hue gradient section that you're painting in will look smooth and continuous. This is not the type of assignment where you can have a movie playing in the background or a Netflix show. You need to have, just be void of distractions. It was hard for me to talk while I was creating this because I was distracting myself from finishing the painting. So just be careful that you're paying attention to what you're doing. Now to create that gradient, remember that you should be taking your brush And you should be pulling it from the left to the right and then the right to the left as you slowly add water to that brush to thin out the pigment. By going back and forth from the left to the right and right to the left will ensure that you're creating a nice even gradient all the way down. Also hold up the board at a 30-degree angle to make sure that that pigment will help flow down towards that center of the triangle. After you've painted your yellow gradient hues, clean off the brush, drag it dry, and lay it flat to dry. Then clean out your water cups, getting 2 clean cups of water to use for the blue section.
Next, we're going to be painting in the blue. I would like you guys to use your ultramarine blue. It's the cooler blue that's going to be right next to the black. When I grade these, I'm going to be grading you on how well you're, one, are you putting the colors in the right section? So like always double check. But are you being neat with your placement? So like for this one, I really need to make sure that I'm painting right along the edges of my lines, like I did in the other two. And the reason why we're actually painting in different sections, so the watercolor has time to dry before we put another color on next to it. If we would put the tints on right now, while this red might still be a little wet, those colors are going to blend into one another and we're no longer going to have these crisp edges. So that's why we're kind of jumping around. But at this point, you guys kind of know the drill. Paint in your blue hues, making sure you have that gradient wash where you're putting in that pigment first. Always double check the placement, making sure you're putting that blue hue in the right portion. So lay down that pigment, and then as you paint into the center of the color wheel, you're going to slowly add just more water to the brush to thin out the pigment on the brush itself. Notice I'm always going back in, increasing the water in previous areas that I've done. So I'm always putting wet paint back onto the edges of previous sections just to make sure that that's not going to dry out before I start blending down, because I don't want to have any harsh lines. So be swift, be smart, and have fun with it. As always, when you're done, clean off your brush, wipe it dry, and lay it flat to dry. The second section that we're going to be painting is going to be our purple section. So this is the fun one because then we actually get to start mixing our blue and our red together. So we're going to be mixing the same red and blue that we use to create our primary colors. You're going to dip your clean brush into the red mixture. And then you're gonna pick up the pigment and place it on the lid of your palette. You don't wanna have it like too much, you don't want it watered down too much because we don't want it to make a tint. So we want like a nice thick consistency of pigment. Before you put your paintbrush in the blue, you need to clean off the brush because we want our brushes to be nice and clean whenever we're putting them in the palette, so we're not like dirtying up the pigment. We wanna keep these nice and pure. So pick up the blue, and I can start mixing it with my red, and you're gonna see it's gonna create a really nice purple. You need a nice amount of watercolor here so you don't run out while you're painting. So I'm just gonna keep adding in more color. Notice I'm cleaning off my brush each time before I put it back in the red. And I'm gonna keep cleaning off my brush even before I put it back in my blue. So once again, those pigments stay nice and clean. This is a nice, deep, rich purple. So I'm happy with this one. I'm gonna start painting it into my colored section here of where I have my hues. I just need to find it first. And you're gonna do the same thing we've previously done. You're painting right up to the edge, getting a nice wet pigment at the top. And then as you paint down, you're slowly adding a little bit of water. Make sure that you're dragging your brush from the left to the right and then the right to the left whenever you're creating that gradient to make sure it's gonna be a nice smooth transition. And once again, to keep this nice and wet and not drying, I'm always going back and adding more wet watercolor to areas that I've already painted just to keep them nice and moist. So whenever I come back to do my gradients, those areas will not have any harsh outlines. You may find after doing that first section that you're running low on purple. So before you paint anymore, always replenish the mixture so you don't like run out in the midst of it and then be royally screwed and have your watercolor dry, and then you get these harsh lines that don't look good. So always replenish your color before, you know, moving on to painting another section within your triangle. And just make sure that that secondary color that you're blending matches the purple that you've already mixed. Before we move on to painting in our orange hue, we need to clean off the lid of our palette. This is why I like always having a paper towel handy that you've, you know, cleaned your brush on, because you can just use the dampened part of that paper towel and clean the palette lid with that. Now it is going to kind of smear the paint around, so dip it into your cleanest water, go back in, and wipe the rest of that pigment off. I just like to do this just so I don't accidentally mix like another pigment in with my orange, because we want to keep our colors nice and pure for our color wheel. And then I always get a second, you know, paper towel just to dry that off. At this point, we will need to get some different water here just to clean it out, so we have nothing changing our colors when we mix our orange. So clean out your water and then come back. Okay, the next section that we're going to paint is going to be our orange. To mix your orange, you're going to be using your light yellow. You want to use a lot of this. So really wet that paint. Remember, we don't want the pigment to be too thin. If the paint is too thin, then it's gonna be really, really hard to create a nice crisp, clean edge. You'll notice in my purple here, like how this little bit looks a little bit fuzzier than my other two sections, and that's because my purple paint had got too watered down. So I ended up having to remix it with less water. So I was gonna have like a crisper appearance. And just be cautious of that you're not thinning out that water too much, but you're keeping it nice, thick, and nice and thick. That way you'll have a much easier time painting. So clean off your brush with from the yellow, and then dip that wet brush into the red, pulling up that pigment, and you'll notice it will like instantly turn orange. We want to make sure we don't create a red orange though. So you only need a little bit of red. To create a proper orange, we're going to need a lot more yellow to mix into this to create that nice even color like we're seeing here in this color wheel. So once you get that nice even orange there, it's not turning into a yellow orange or the red orange, then you can start painting that in to the orange section. We'll be using the same technique we've always done, where you're doing that gradient on dry. Always double check that you're painting your hues in the right spot.
And this is what you should have by the end of your painting section today. You should have your red, orange, yellow, blue, and purple hues painted in as gradient washes on dry watercolor paper. Take a picture of your work when it's done and submit it into Schoology. Please don't forget to properly clean off your brush. So soap it up with some of the soap that you've been given, clean off the lid of your palette, and then you'll be ready to paint tomorrow.